Okay, well, this is it, the last or 12th DVD in the series, and this is the one you've probably almost been waiting for, and you may actually be watching it before the end. This is, yes, how to do those assignments. So you should find that there's a lot of information on D2L, and there are handouts that go with each assignment, kind of telling you how to do them, and there is a thing called the project guide, which tells you how to do the big paper, and there is a grading rubric which has all of these things on it, which gives you how many points you get for each section. But in class, students often have questions, and so I figured I would give you guys an opportunity to watch on tape if you want how to do the assignments. So first of all, the mini assignments, what I would like you to turn in would be, and as it states in the syllabus, a self-monitoring, a goal attainment scale, a scale that you have developed, an A/B project, and a copy of the treatment plan that you will be using for the big project. So those are 5 mini assignments, and those are 10 points apiece. And they're all described in the syllabus and on D2L. For the big project, which is the final paper due at the end, what this is, and I think that almost all of you who are taking this class have taken a class in which you wrote a sort of traditional research paper, APA-style empirical paper. And when I say that, what I mean is if you took a research class with me or a research class with someone at the undergraduate level here at Walla Walla College, or with someone in the Montana program, or at whatever whatever undergraduate college or university you went to, that most of you write an APA-style paper which starts with an abstract, moves on to an introductory section, has a methods, results, and discussion section, and then has references and maybe appendices. Generally speaking, though, when you do that as a research project, what you're doing is you're looking at, for your methods section, gathering information on people who you would call subjects. And you usually find like a survey or something like that. You find a group of subjects, such as several classrooms with nice, kind teachers who let you come in for 10 minutes of time. You distribute your survey, you get it back, you take the information, you put it into a program like SPSS, you analyze it, you do a bunch of scary statistics, you write them up in your results section. This paper follows the same format, but instead of having it be with a lot of people to test a theory or to figure out how it is that people feel about, No Child Left Behind, or how people feel about sex offender notification laws or something like that, this paper is a story. And this paper is a story about one person. And the one person that this paper is a story about is either a client with whom you are working. Now, if you have your, anger management group for people who've been referred to you by the judge for road rage, and you really want to do a paper on them, you are welcome to do a paper with a group as your client. If you do social skills with kindergartners and you want to do your social skills kindergarten group as your client, that is absolutely fine. For most of you, though, it will very likely be that you will choose a client who is one individual, whether that's an adult, whether that's a kid. And for some of you, if it's just really hard for you to have a client who is willing and able, and where the agency is comfortable with you writing about the client, where you need to completely, put down fictitious identifying information and so forth, but maintaining client's confidentiality, no names, no agency names, no specific details about the client. Still, sometimes it's hard to find a client and hard to find a supervisor who's comfortable with you writing a paper about this and turning it into me, and that fits the timeline of this class. All of that said, some of you may choose to use yourself as the client, and you are more than welcome to do that, and see this paper as the great self-improvement opportunity. And things that students have worked on in the past are, many graduate students find that their eating really could be healthier. I've had students say, Heather, I have gained 30 or 40 pounds since being in this program. So improved nutrition of eating and perhaps weight loss. Students will often find that if they used to exercise faithfully before coming to the program, exercise has sort of flown out the window. You may want to work on part of your social work skills. Maybe you're working with a new population and you really aren't very comfortable in your practicum and you're not quite sure what to do with this population. So you could improve your skills there. Maybe you are really struggling with raising a child and moving into the role of mother or father after having just been sort of, adult person. So you might want to improve your parenting skills or something. So anything that's pertinent, relevant, meaningful to you, if you choose to be the client of this paper, it is then a story about you. If I have a slight preference that you would choose a client, but appreciating that sometimes that's just a hard thing to do. So the story is, what is the topic that the client is coming in for? That is the intro. So if the client is coming in to work on depression, to work on alcoholism, to work on dealing with childhood sexual trauma now that they're an adult, to work on developing social skills with Asperger's disorder, whatever is the concern, that goes into the intro section. The methods section is, this is who the paper's about. This is the intervention that we did to bring about change. This is how we measure change, and here's a copy of either the treatment plan from the client's chart, if you do a treatment plan in your agency, or the treatment plan that we talked about on disc number 11 from class, where you have goal, action, step, measure, goal, action, steps, measure, goal, action, steps, measure, but a copy of the treatment plan. The results are what happened, and the discussion is, now let's put it all together and make sense of it. So that is sort of the quick outline of the story of your client. So let us pick a hypothetical client and tell a story, and let me go into detail about the sections. So let's say that you are working with let me pull a client out of the sky. You are working with a 24-year-old female who comes in just sort of, life is crazy. She's got some features that might be described as borderline personality kinds of features. She's got some post-traumatic stress kind of features. She's got crazy relationships. She has a history of drinking and drugging. And when you talk with her about her childhood, she has a very lengthy childhood of foster care, sexual abuse from family members, sexual abuse from others, domestic violence witnessed in many of the places she lived. This is just your sort of, sadly, far too typical picture of a client that many of you regularly work with. So, goodness, with all this to work on, how do I make a nice cohesive story that makes sense? Let us follow the format. You start with an abstract. An abstract, and read your APA manual. If you do not have an APA manual, borrow one from a friend to get a sense of the format of this paper. I would recommend, before any of you start writing this paper, go on to D2L in Contents, where it has the handout that says project. Take each of these sections and put them as sections or subsections on your computer, so you have that framework there. If you are missing one of these sections, you get no credit for that section. So if you leave out an abstract that's 5 points, you start at a 95. If you leave out a transition that's 5 points, again, you start at a 95. If you leave out an abstract and a transition, you start at a 90. So put all of these sections on your computer so you know to fill in information for each of them. The abstract, however, is best written after the paper is done, because the abstract is the very brief summary of, this is what my paper is about. And you know what your paper is about after you've written it. You may not know exactly what it's about before you've written it. APA stops you at 120 words. Max. So, very brief. A way I recommend writing it is, write your paper, then take a sentence and write a synopsis of your intro. A sentence, a synopsis of your method. A sentence, a synopsis of your results. A sentence, synopsis of your discussion. You got 4 sentences, you put them together, there's your abstract, done. And it's done after the paper. 5 points. Your introductory section. This is where you sort of want to talk about the issue or issues that are relevant to your client and relevant to especially what your intervention is and what it is you're looking at. So if you have this client who I just described with just sort of a life history of turmoil and chaos, what do you want to tell the story of? What do you do your lit review on? So you kind of have to decide if it's a client with multiple issues, what is most relevant? And let's say that what you decide is most relevant here is just sort of her history of trauma, and you're going to sort of focus on trauma of sexual abuse, the trauma of switching from family to family to family, and kind of the chaos that causes, the PTSD symptoms that causes. And since she grew up in a lot of foster care homes, maybe a little bit of stuff on attachment disorder or reactive attachment. So attachment problems, multiple traumas, PTSD symptoms, those may be your areas you choose to focus on. Start the paper with an introduction, which is usually about 1 to 2 paragraphs in length. In your introduction to the paper, what I would like to see you include, and as a matter of fact, to get full credit, what you need to include is, what is my topic? This is a paper about what it's like to grow up in, what it's like to be born into a very troubled family, be sexually and physically abused and neglected at a very early age, go through the foster care system in our nation, and as a young adult to struggle with just a childhood of turmoil and trauma and no real good solid attachment figure. That's what the topic is, or about a person who experiences. Then, tell the reader why it matters. So this is a story about a person who was raised in foster care as a result of, this very difficult biological family, multiple foster home placements, all sorts of trauma. She comes to me with PTSD symptoms, borderline symptoms in her early 20s. This is the topic of this paper. Why does it matter? Well, it matters because A, it's very important to her, and B, sadly, she ain't the only one. There are thousands of kids in America whose life story is not too dissimilar from hers. And here's where you might want to, if you have some statistics, this many kids go through the foster care system, or put into the foster care system each year. This many kids graduate out of the foster care system each year. These are the outcomes of these kids who graduate out of the foster care system. And for those of you not familiar with the research, the outcomes are troubling. Many of these kids end up in psych hospitals and end up in prison. It's a system which we've finally paid attention to within the last decade, really needs fixing, and we're trying to make some changes, but they're slow. So this is the topic. This is why it matters. This influences a lot of people, and these do end up being our prison inmates and our psychiatric clients and people who live on, public assistance and just really struggle, and then they have kids and they don't know how to do better with their kids, and it's a huge social problem. Off my soapbox. Why it matters. Then, sort of preview your paper. And this is a very perfunctory section that says something to the effect of, this paper will start with a review of the literature on, and then, what are you going to cover? A review of the literature on attachment disorder and sexual trauma, looking at PTSD, and some papers on the foster care system in America. It will then focus on one young woman who was raised in the foster care system and the difficulties she had, and her work with a therapist to help her overcome some of these so that her life would be better, more healthy, or something like that than it might otherwise be. So this is what it's about. This is why it's important. And here is a preview of my paper. It's going to start with a literature review, and then it's going to talk about one person in treatment. And so you preview. This is what you're going to read here. You then do your literature review. For this paper, my requirement is that you have a minimum of 10 scholarly sources. Those are sources that come from refereed journals or professional books. If you do your lit search on the computer, as probably all of you will, the way to do this is to go into the Walla Walla College Library webpage and to pull up databases such as PsycInfo, such as Social Work Abstracts, Social Science Index, ERIC, which is the Educational Resources, Academic Search Premier. Click on peer-reviewed or scholarly sources. If you don't want to have to go to a library and chase things down, click on links to full text or full text only. And then start typing in your topics. If you Google this, if you go to Yahoo, if you go to some general website, you are going to get 2 million hits, and 3 of them are going to be from scholarly sources. It is way easier to get 300 hits, all of which are from scholarly sources, than 2 million, and you have to find the 3 good ones. So start with a scholarly source. If you're not sure what a scholarly source is, look it up, send me an email, give me a telephone call, and I will go over that with you. You want a minimum of 10 scholarly sources. You are welcome to use a book. But if you use a book, my sort of definition of a professional or scholarly book is that it has references in it so that you can look and see who actually did the research that the author in the book is citing. So, minimum of 10. I've given a handout, Hints for Writing an APA Literature Review Paper, which is in Contents on D2L. And there are kind of 2 ways to craft a lit review that I see students turning in. One is what I call the laundry list way of turning in a paper. And it is my preference that by the time you're in graduate school, you move beyond the laundry list into sort of option 2. Laundry list is you have your 10 sources. You read your first source, you type up a summary. You put the source aside. You read the second source, you type a summary. You put it aside. You read the third source, you type a summary, you put it aside. In the end, you have a summary of 10 articles, you stick them all together, squinch them in your word processor, and there's your lit review. I could just as well snip all of those 10 summaries apart, organize them in any way, shape, or form, put them back together, and the lit review would be the same because it's organized simply by this article said this, and then this article said this, and the next article said this, and the next article said this. What a more scholarly, more thoughtful, more interesting to read, but more difficult paper to write is that you get your 10 sources or your 15 sources or however many you get, 10 minimum. You read them all, and you say, what do these sources all have to say about growing up in a troubled family and through the foster care system? What did I learn? You read them all, you take a walk, you eat a sliced pizza, you sit down at your computer, and you brain dump. This is what I learned. Then it's organized in your brain, it's organized by thought, it's organized by theme. And then you go back and you fit your sources in, you cite sources when, and use the handout to tell you again when if this isn't something that you have well ingrained into you from your undergrad work. But you cite your sources when A, you make a declarative statement or a fact. So if I make a statement that says, 80% of kids who come out of foster care will spend at least one night in prison. I totally made that up off the top of my head, so do not think that that's a serious quote. But let's say I make that statement. That is a fact. I must cite my source. If I say kids who are raised in foster care do worse than kids who are raised by their biological parents, that still is pretty close to a fact or a fact. Cite your source. Anytime you make a declarative statement, cite your source. That's APA style. If I tell you about a study, Von der Fecht, open parenthesis, 2007, close parenthesis, did a study on foster care kids. You cite it. You say this is the author and this is the date. If I do a quote, I pull the exact words that the author said and I put them in quotation marks. You must cite your source. But you need to cite at times other than quoting. So if you have a declarative statement, if you're describing a study, you must also cite. If you're paraphrasing something, you must cite. When do you choose to quote as compared to cite? My preference as a teacher is that you minimize your quotes. It's hard to read a paper that's filled with quotes. My operational definition is I would be happy if I saw no quotes, and I really like to see no more than one per page, and I'm far happier to see fewer than one per page. Choose to quote when somebody says something brilliant, it's eloquent, and you can't state it any better yourself, and you want to put their words with all of their integrity into your text. That's when to choose a quote. Now, the other time that sometimes you choose a quote, but it's not quite as good, is when an author says something so convoluted that you can't understand it, and you can't put it in your own words without getting it wrong. It would then be better to quote it than to get it wrong. However, it would be good for you to understand what you're writing. If they say something that's so confusing to you that you're not sure what it is and you can't put it in your own words, you might not really know what it is that you're saying, but boy, it sounded good. At least keep the quotes around to make sure it's accurate. However, it would be better to clarify it so you can understand it before deciding that it's even worth putting in. However, that is a time when people quote as if they can't figure out what it is, but it sure sounds important. But the ideal time to quote is when someone says something and it's so beautiful the way they said it, or so meaningful, that you want to keep it exactly intact. And that's when you put quotes around it. You cite author, date, and you must cite the page number for direct quotes. So, organize by theme, slide in your references to support, and try to have this really be a thematically meaningful paper with a purpose. And the purpose should be sort of to substantiate that what the work I'm doing with my client really makes some sense. Another thing you can include in your literature, you can include the issues that your client's working with. You could also include some articles on the treatment. So if you're going to do cognitive behavioral therapy for PTSD, there's a big thing in one of the agencies where I'm working right now, trauma-focused CBT, and a number of agencies that where I do liaison work in Tri-Cities have all been to trainings on TFCBT. So let's say that you read a bunch of stuff and you love TFCBT. So you might do some articles on the clinical concerns that your client has, and then do some on TFCBT, which is this great intervention that works really well with clients just like mine. So you do your intro. You do your lit review. Transition. The transition is the bridge. It goes from the literature, here's what the big shots, the scholars, the people who know this stuff are saying about it, to, and here's my paper. So what you want to have here is this section starts with a summary. And the summary is 2 to 3 sentences, or a paragraph, depending on how sort of lengthy your literature review is, but 2 to 3 sentences to a paragraph that just says, you know, this is what we learned from the literature. A, B, C. So you've read a whole bunch of articles, you've written a whole bunch of stuff, and now, in sum, what the literature tells us is, A, kids who are raised in foster care go through many difficulties. B, kids who have experienced sexual trauma, physical abuse, and neglect tend to have troubles. C, trauma-focused CBT is a very promising new intervention for people with PTSD and a history of trauma. There's my summary. Now, I preview my study. This looks pretty redundant with this. It is. This is a preview of the whole paper. This is a preview of the study. But this is, okay, so now I summarize the literature, and now that we know this, we are going to focus on one specific young woman who has come into treatment to work on some of the struggles she's had as a result of her traumatic childhood. And we're going to look at the intervention and how effective it was. There is your transition section. So that's your lit review, and generally speaking, this runs about 4 to 6 pages. If people are very succinct writers, you can shrink it down. If you're a very expansive writer, you like to put in a lot of detail, you decide that, you know, your 10 articles, is okay, but you really work with a lot of clients like this and you really want to take this opportunity to write this paper to learn a ton. So you read 22 articles. Well, 22 articles just takes often longer to write about than 10 does. So this 4 to 6 is sort of a nice average length for a lit review, but give or take, I'm not counting pages. Please don't turn in a 50-page lit review. It's a little on the lengthy side. If it's 1 or 2 pages, you're going to get it back from me. It's going to say you need more detail in order to get full credit. That's the lit section, and that tends to be by far the hardest section to write. The method section, your client. Describe your client in 1 to 2 paragraphs. And describe your client as is relevant to this paper. So you could probably, if you've worked with your client for a long time, you could write a book on your client. 1 to 2 paragraphs. Describe your client as is relevant to what you're working on in this paper. Intervention. What is it that you and your client are doing to address the issues that you are focusing on in this paper? So if you're working on, let's say you're doing trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy, that's your intervention. So you would say, okay, here's the client who comes in, and these are some of her presenting concerns. And this is a little about what she's like. And in our work together, she would really like to focus on thus and such. Intervention. So we're doing trauma-focused CBT. And in TFCBT, this is what she and I are doing. And you would describe, she's coming in every week or she's coming in twice a week, and we're working individually, and we're focusing on, giving her some good skills to sort of be able to handle her anxiety better. And then we're going to do a trauma narrative, and you would sort of describe, this is our work that we are doing. Measure. This is how do I measure the impact of my intervention? What is it that you're looking at with your client? So you need something fairly specific here. So let's say that what you decide to work on with your client here is you're going to look at her mood. Let's say she has real serious troubles with nightmares. So you're going to work on her nightmares, and let's say that she just feels terribly anxious around other people. So you're going to work on her social skills. So these are sort of 3 areas that with this client for this paper you're going to focus on. So your intervention should address the fact that you're working on these skills. And then your measure section is how are you measuring whether she's changing in these areas. Now for this paper, I'm asking each of you to choose at least 2 areas from the 4 areas of measures that we've covered in class. So we've talked about self-monitoring, we've talked about goal attainment scaling, we've talked about rapid assessment inventories, psychological inventories, scales, whatever you want to call them, some sort of, Beck depression inventory, state trait anxiety inventory kind of thing. And we've talked about doing some sort of pre-post measure A-B design with a graph. Choose 2 of those styles of measure and measure the client's issues on this. So let's say you decide one thing you want to do is to do a goal attainment scale. And you want each of these 3 things that you and she are working on to be a goal. Improve mood, reduce nightmares, improve social skills. Goal attainment scale. In your measure section, you describe, the client and I developed a goal attainment scale. We had 3 goals. Goal 1, improve mood. Goal 2, reduce nightmares. Goal 3, improve social skills. Now, there's 1. You need a second measure. Well, you could choose to use a Beck depression inventory to measure her mood if depression is a problem she's having. Do a BDI pre and a BDI post. You could choose to use some sort of stress inventory to measure her mood. You could also say, well, let's do a self-monitoring. We could do a self-monitoring of her mood, and we could look at, we could look at her mood, we could look at the situation, every hour she could track her mood, and who she's with, and what she's doing, and so forth and so on. Some kind of self-monitoring that would look at mood. So you could look at, any of the intervention tools that we have used. Choose 2 of those. Figure out how this would fit here. The treatment plan. The treatment plan is, as we discussed on the treatment plan tape, pick what are the goals that the client's working on. And again, here, if it's increase mood, decrease nightmares, improve social skills, those would be your 3 things. What are the action steps? What are you doing to help her improve her mood? How are you measuring that? What are we doing to reduce nightmares? Reduce nightmares, goal 2. What are the action steps that we're doing to help her reduce nightmares? Goal 3, improve social skills. What are the action steps that we're taking to improve social skills? That's your treatment plan. The results section. The results section in the narrative part, that's type. Those are your words. How do I describe what I see on my measures? So if we did the goal attainment scale, on goal 1, improve mood, the client started at much less than expected level of attainment and moved to more than expected. On goal 2, reduce nightmares, the client started at much less than expected level of attainment and didn't make much progress. She only moved to less than expected level of attainment. On goal 3, social skills, the client started at much less than expected, made dramatic gains, ended up at much more than expected. This was a goal where she really made good strides. On the Beck Depression Inventory, when the client started, her score was a 35. This puts her in the moderately high range of depression. At the end of our work together, 6 weeks later, 10 weeks later, whatever, the client's score had fallen to a 17. While still indicating some depression, this puts her at a much healthier level and represents a fairly substantial drop in her level of depression. So that's a narrative. It's the description of what you found. If you do a self-monitoring and you have a client who's monitored, let's say she likes writing things down on paper and she has charted 6 different columns over the course of a month, well, you certainly don't want to go through and say, well, at 8 o'clock on the first morning, this was what her mood was, and this is who she was with, and then at 9 o'clock on the first morning, and then at 10 o'clock, you'll be writing a 200-page paper. Just do a basic description. These were what she was tracking, and the self-monitoring seemed to show, and then summarize it in a couple sentences. So this is just in words, describe the data. Charts is then include in an appendix a copy of the goal attainment scale, a copy of the graph for AB, a copy of, if you want to do like some sort of psychological inventory and your agency doesn't want to let out a copy with the client's answers on it, if you can just photocopy a blank copy of, let's say, the Hamilton Depression Scale. So I see a blank copy, and then you say the client's pre-score was a 22 and the client's post-score was a 10. I don't need to see exactly where the client circled and everything. If the client and the agency are welcome to just take the client's name off and include a photocopy, that's fine, but I only need to see a blank copy of the form and then what the client's scores were. If it's a self-monitoring and the client has, all this handwriting on page after page after page after page, you can just say these are the columns and include a blank copy of the self-monitoring. If you're doing it on yourself, I'd like to see at least a few days, but if you did a self-monitoring for a month, I don't need to see every single day of the month, but I would like to see a few days at the beginning and a few days at the end of it, just to do a comparison. So the charts are hand me in copies of the actual forms on which the data was collected. Results section is usually method section, 1 to 2 paragraphs, 1 to 2 paragraphs, 1 to 2 paragraphs, include a copy of the treatment plan. So it generally tends to run about a page, page and a half. Results section, again, tends to run about a page, page and a half tops. The results is, here are the facts. This is what the data says. That's it. You don't interpret, you don't pontificate, you don't say what it means, just here's what we found. This is what the GAS said, this is what the pre-test score, post-test score was, this is what we learned from the self-monitoring, this is what the AB shows, da-da-da-da-da-da, and then it went down, da-da-da-da-da-da. For a copy, please see the appendix. Or if you want to, include the charts right there in the paper itself. The discussion is where you make sense of it all. So that is, what does it mean? let's say that you expected that trauma-focused CBT should really work for helping your client improve her mood, reduce her nightmares, and I'm not sure how much it really addresses social skills, but you expected mood to improve, nightmares to go down, and as a result of feeling better and getting more sleep, you would expect maybe social skills by themselves would come along. Let's say this isn't what happened at all. In your discussion section, you say, the results section says, client didn't get any better in, the words of data. In the discussion section, you got to make sense of that. Well, the client came in with a history of trauma, with symptoms of depression and PTSD. We did trauma-focused CBT. The literature says it should work very well with a client like this. The therapist was fairly well trained, and yet the client really didn't change at all. Isn't that interesting? I wonder what's going on. So you make sense of it. Or let's say the client changes wonderfully. Hey, the literature says the client should change, and she did. This is very cool. And as a matter of fact, this is sort of how come it is that she changed. Well, she showed up regularly for her sessions, and she really worked the program very well, and she expressed, just absolute happiness that finally, for the first time in her life, things seem to be coming together and making sense for her. So this is kind of, tell me what the data means. This is tell me what it says. This is interpret it and tell me what it means. While you're doing that, tie it to the literature. Is this what you expected to find? Is it very different from what you expected to find? If it's completely different and very surprising, an astute writer might go to the literature and see if they can find another article that explains it, although I'm not mandating that you do that, but that's if you were going to publish. If you found something very, very different from what you expected, you might go back to the literature and say, is there something that we missed, or is there something that can help explain this? But I would like you to use the literature to sort of help substantiate your findings or explain your findings. You also need a section on limitations. The limitations are, what could we have done better? Everybody in this class pretty much could say in limitations, if you just can't, I'm sure this is a perfect study, except for the fact that, well, it's only with one person. And so even if it works for her beautifully, it doesn't guarantee it would work for anybody else. So everyone has, as a limitation, it is a single subject study, and then it's hard to know if it would generalize to somebody else. There are usually other limitations which come up, and just sort of document what they are. If you could have done it differently, are there shortcomings? What would you have done differently? What would make it better? And the last thing is conclusions, and please close with conclusions. If you close with limitations, you go out with a fizzle. It's much better to go out strong. So your concluding comments are, go out with a bang, say what you found, say why it matters. And each of these sections sort of, you could do them as a separate, 1 or 2 paragraphs, or you can kind of put everything together, except that really go out with a clear concluding paragraph or several paragraphs so that you go out strong. The last 2 parts are the references. In an APA-style paper, there is a complete correspondence of works that you cite in the body of the paper and the reference section. So nothing should be included in the reference section that you don't cite, and you should cite nothing that you don't include in the reference section. 1-to-1 correspondence. Now, let's just say, as I talk to your scholarly articles, let's say you have read the best article on your topic in Newsweek. Can you include it? Well, I don't want you to include it in your 10 minimum scholarly articles. But if you want to include 11 articles, you can include it as your 11th article. Now, if you can include Newsweek, does it mean you can include anything? Well, there are better sort of periodical popular literature articles, and then there are worse ones. So Newsweek, fairly respectable source. The National Enquirer is a highly unrespectable source. In between Newsweek and the National Enquirer, there is a lot of different articles. But, if it's a fairly well-respected periodical publication, then you can include that in addition to 10 scholarly sources. If it's real schlocky, the National Enquirer is not known as purely guaranteed, peer-reviewed, scholarly, scientific stuff. Cosmopolitan magazine probably isn't the most scholarly source you're ever going to find. So use your judgment on non-scholarly sources, and you need 10 scholarly sources. These can be additional ones. And there is a one-to-one correspondence. You cite it in the beginning of the paper, you reference it at the end. If it's at the end, it must be cited somewhere in the beginning. And then include appendices if they don't go into the charts section. So if you're doing something like a Hamilton Depression Scale and you don't want to put that in the results section, then in the results section say a copy of the Hamilton is in the appendix. A copy of the depression inventory can be found in the appendix, and that's what goes in that section. And that pretty much should be what this paper includes. As I said, there are several handouts listed in contents. One is the project guide. It has the grading rubric in it. And then there are the APA hints. Please be sure to read the APA hints. They tell you how to cite and when to cite, and they tell you the difference between citing and quoting, and it tells you how to write a sort of thematically integrated literature review as compared to the laundry list. So it's hopefully, and it gives you an example of either of those styles of writing. So be sure to read that. It'll help you with the paper. And please put this outline on your computer before you start to write the paper, because as I said, if a section isn't included, your grade starts just minus all those points no matter how outstandingly perfect the rest of the paper is. So be sure to include each section. And I think that that's all I have to say about the paper. Feel free to send me an email, get onto D2L in the question section, zip me a copy, or give me a telephone call if you have any questions. And that is the end of tape 12.